Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and this is Redlines. My guest today is co-founder of the anti-war group CODEPINK, Medea Benjamin. She recently traveled to Ecuador as part of CODEPINK's election observation delegation for the presidential vote. Welcome to Redlines, Medea.
Nice to be on with you, Anya.
Let's start, before we get into the vote itself and developments in Ecuador, with what exactly happened to you as you returned to the United States?
I was going through the customs and gave my passport at the passport check, and they immediately looked at the computer and gave me a special don't go through the go pass. In fact, I had to go for the interrogation line, which took me into the bowels of the customs bureaucracy, where I was then questioned for about 90 minutes about where I was and what I was doing. But in addition to questions like who paid for your trip, what were the elections like where you visited, they kept confusing Ecuador and Venezuela. And it seems that they were most interested in the Venezuela. And in fact, they asked me what life was like in Venezuela. When I insisted I was coming from Ecuador, they said, "But you've been to Venezuela, just tell us what life is like there. We really want to learn from you," which I thought was quite funny. I told them I could recommend some books they could read or websites they could go to if they really wanted to know what was going on in Venezuela, but that I was actually coming from Ecuador. So it went on for quite a long time. They wanted to know who won the elections. How do you spell his name? Guillermo Lasso. That took quite a long time. But it was clear that it was just about hassling and to make it clear to me that they had me in their sights and that they were mostly concerned about the issue of Venezuela and any relationship I might have with that country.
And this is part of a campaign of harassment targeting anti-war journalists, particularly for work on Venezuela. I remember back in 2019, DHS agents detained Sergio Torres, a friend of ours, while he was traveling back from Venezuela, questioning him extensively about his role in opposing the U.S. coup attempt against the country's government. Why do you think this work is so threatening to the U.S. government?
I think that there are countries that the U.S. is particularly focused on trying to overthrow those regimes, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or places like Cuba, North Korea. When you visit those places, you get particular scrutiny. I know in my case, ever since I returned from a visit to Iran, when I came back and there were actually FBI agents waiting for me, it was very funny because they had a whole stack of papers to give me. And one of them is how I could register to be a foreign agent for the Iranian government, which I laughed and said I had no intention of doing that. But I have been on their target for secondary screening ever since Iran. So it's just part of a U.S. government effort to hassle anybody who tries to reach out and have a better understanding of those countries that the U.S. labels as the enemy.
And of course, you and Sergio were both part of the Embassy Protection Collective, which was an effort to prevent the U.S. from illegally seizing the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. It was very effective in staving off the takeover for several weeks, over a month. And so you certainly frustrated the forces in Washington with that effort. Medea,
I just want to say that there were many people in Ecuador who actually knew about that. And when they saw our badges as official observers from CODEPINK, they would often come up and say, aha, we watched that Embassy Protection Collective, and they were very sympathetic with what we had done.
And I know from my experience in Venezuela, that was the case as well. Let's pivot to discussing your recent trip to Ecuador. As I mentioned, you were observing the presidential elections, which saw the victory of neoliberal candidate Guillermo Lasso. Can you tell me, were you surprised by these results, and what do they mean for the people of Ecuador?
When we first got down to Ecuador before the elections, the polls had showed that the progressive Andrés Arauz was winning. And that seemed to be the general sentiment until very close to the election day. And then I started seeing troubling signs, we learned more about the context of those elections. And then the day of, when we were visiting the different polling places, I kept seeing that so many of the votes were going to Guillermo Lasso. I realized that the Arauz campaign was in big trouble. And we were there as election observers. And on the day of the elections, things seemed quite professional, well organized, fair, no signs of fraud. And yet you can't put the election in the context of one day. You have to put it in the much broader context where things were so unfair, so unequal, so undemocratic that it's hard to call this election a free and fair one.
Yeah, let's get into that a bit. What do you believe contributed to this defeat of the left in Ecuador?
I would turn on the TV in our hotel room in the evening and be changing the channels. And it was like as if every channel were Fox News, every channel in favor of Lasso. And they all had different reasoning why and different arguments about how terrible things would be if Arauz won. But the main thing is that they have run a media campaign for the last 4 years, really distorting the legacy of the former president, Rafael Correa. And so instead of remembering all of the achievements that had been made during his time in office, and there were many, reducing poverty by double digits, building roads and schools and hospitals, and giving all kinds of opportunities to the poorer sectors of the community, those were erased by the media campaigns that wanted to give across the idea that Rafael Correa was corrupt, that his government was one of an authoritarian dictatorship, and that they had to continue the, quote, return to democracy that had been started 4 years ago when Lenin Moreno, who was handpicked by Correa but turned against Correa, had led the country for the last 4 years in a disastrous direction. But they were trying to really blame that on Correa. That was one of the major factors, which was the media is so skewed and owned by the right wing that was in favor of the conservative banker Guillermo Lasso. It made it very hard to get a real narrative across.
And who is Guillermo Lasso, and what role will he play in the broader region?
Well, he's a conservative banker. He has been working pretty much behind the scenes with the last government of Lenin Moreno, but he is known to have supported the IMF austerity program. He will continue with that kind of austerity program. He will continue with the attacks on the left. One of those tactics that has been used very forcefully and very brutally has been what's called lawfare, which is to throw the book at all of the progressive leadership, from Rafael Correa to his vice president, who's been languishing in prison under terrible conditions, to other high-level people within Correa's movement. And that will continue, unfortunately, I think, under Lasso for the next 4 years. But then there is also the issue of how will he deal with the economy and the pandemic. And so far, the record of this government that has been horrific, with Ecuador, one of the worst cases in Latin America, very few vaccines coming in, a hospital system and a healthcare system in general that has been gutted in the last 4 years. And so Lasso will face a very difficult time trying to bring the country out of the pandemic, trying to reduce the levels of unemployment when so many people in Ecuador work in the informal sector and their incomes have been decimated. When you have someone in power who is going to continue on the path of slashing the budget, of going for the austerity, it's going to be a very difficult 4 years.
And I'm sure we can expect him to act as an ally of Washington, endorsing the recognition of Juan Guaido, the coup leader in Venezuela, and overall acting as that kind of force in the region. Medea, did your group have any concerns going into the vote about fairness, and what did you observe on Election Day?
Well, in the meetings that we had leading up to Election Day, we were really concerned because, as we said, we had so many people telling us about the difficulties of Andrés Arauz to even get registered. The party was not allowed to register. He was not allowed to use the voice or the image of Rafael Correa. It took him a long time to find a party that was willing to lend its party affiliation to the Arauz campaign and be able to get registered by the National Election Council. And so it was very last-minute campaign. And then to also recognize that the key people who know how to run campaigns were either in exile, in prison, or facing tremendous persecution by the government. So we really felt that it was already going to be difficult for Arauz to overcome those obstacles. On the other hand, he did come out way ahead in the first round. And as I said, the polls did show him leading. So we found that it was just one of those situations where you had to put the whole thing in this broader context or you would not understand. There were also criticisms we heard of not only the campaign itself, but of the time under Correa, where people told us that he was a good manager, that he got a lot of things done, but that he did not build up the base and the social movements that would be the groundwork for the campaign of Andrés Arauz, so that you didn't find a strong sector of the unions, the indigenous community, women's groups, etc., students that would be out campaigning for the progressive candidate. And people told us of problems that Correa had with a number of those sectors where he did not listen to them closely enough, bring them into the government, the alienation of people within the indigenous movement of CONAI turned out to be disastrous for Arauz's campaign, because the CONAI refused to support Arauz because of the problems that they had previously with Correa. And the leadership in CONAI had told people to annul their votes, to vote blank. And so many of them did that it became a key, if not the key factor in why Arauz didn't win the election, because if a larger number of them had supported Arauz, who really had a policy platform that was something that would be beneficial to the indigenous community, but instead they voted in blank.
And how much of an influence did Yaku Perez, the candidate who was eliminated in the third round, My colleague Ben Norton wrote a long piece looking into his background as someone who kind of used the Indigenous movement to push support for the right U.S. policy more broadly. Did he call for these null votes, and how much do you think he factored into the ultimate results here?
Yes, I mean, in the first round, he did extraordinarily well, and he surprised people throughout Ecuador at how well he did. And in fact, he contested and thought that he should be put in second place instead of Guillermo Lasso, because it was very close between the two of them, with Andrés Arauz having come out significantly ahead of all of them. And he played a role of saying that you shouldn't vote for either of those candidates because neither of them represents us. And because voting is mandatory in Ecuador, it wasn't just saying, he couldn't just say, don't vote. So instead, he said, vote blank. And there was a lot of division within the Indigenous community itself, with the leader of CONAI, which is the grassroots base, and then the political arm is Pachakutik, which was represented by Yacu Perez. The grassroots base, the head of it came out just 2 days before the election, saying that people should vote for the progressive candidate, Andrés Arauz. But then he was immediately attacked within the party and other members of the Indigenous organization, saying that he did not represent them. Anyway, people perhaps he had enough influence that a significant number of the Indigenous community would go with the progressive candidate, but that turned out not to be the case. In terms of the power that the Indigenous movement might have going forward, they will have quite a lot of power because they have a large number of seats in the National Assembly, and the party of Guillermo Lasso has a very small number of seats, and so we'll need to make alliances. It is to be seen whether Pachakutik, the Indigenous party, will make its alliance with the conservative Guillermo Lasso, or if they will go towards the progressives, and that we might see a big division between the grassroots that will want the more progressive agenda and the leadership that wants to get access to power, cabinet seats, other goodies from the Lasso government.
And what about the Correísta movement going forward? What are their plans? And I don't know if you have any knowledge of Arauz's plans specifically.
It's not clear what Arauz himself will be doing, but it is clear that people recognize that they did not build up the base the way they need to. And some said that the silver lining in the loss is that it's going to be a very difficult time to be a president in this when there is such a terrible pandemic, bad economic situation, and that this is the time to really build up a solid base of support among the different sectors of society in Ecuador, so that they can use their power in the National Assembly, where they are the #1 bloc, and they can use it to contest the conservative policies of the Lasso government, and they can also use it to build up to be able to run a better campaign the next time around.
What was the sense you got from locals as you discussed the current political situation and the years leading up to it? What will they see as the legacy of current President Lenin Moreno?
Lenin Moreno has an approval rating as he leaves office of under 10%. Some polls show 7, some show as low as 4. I mean, it's absolutely miserable the way that he has not been able to deal with the pandemic, the way the economy has been devastated under his rule, scandals, including 5 different ministers of health having come in, scandal of some of them giving the few vaccines that were available to their friends and families and the elites. So he has a terrible approval rating. And I think that it was interesting during this campaign that because he is so unpopular, the opposition wanted to paint him as being a part of the legacy of Correa, where the truth is that he laid the basis for what will be the government now of Lasso, the same austerity programs that were happening during the last 4 years. So there were some big uprisings in October of 2019 against the austerity program, particularly in government's call to cut the subsidies for gasoline. And the indigenous people started the movement, and then many others joined in. And they were violently repressed by the government, but they managed to force the government to roll back the cut in subsidies. People are thinking that this is the time in the next 4 years, with a very bad economic situation, that there will probably be more uprisings of that kind. And so I think there will be periods of great instability in the coming years, but that will also be a time when the left can regroup.
And finally, Medea, you talked about the crackdown the Lenin Moreno government has waged on supporters of the Correísta movement and its greatest political figures, its most notable political figures. Can you give some specific details of that effort to jail and suppress the movement, and also whether or not the Organization of American States, which is quick to denounce the government in, for example, Venezuela or Cuba for what it claims are human rights abuses, has it said anything about the situation in Ecuador?
No, the Organization of American States has not condemned anything that the Lenin Moreno government did. In fact, they've been very close to the Lenin Moreno government, as has the U.S. government. And just before the elections, it was quite strange timing. Just weeks before the election, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee came out with a note saying how pleased they were to have met with Lenin Moreno, how that government had moved Ecuador onto the road of democracy, the importance of the free market system. And it just showed how much they had ignored all of these violations, whether it was the crackdown on the people who rose up in the October 2019 demonstrations, and a number of those people continue to be in jail today, or the attacks on Rafael Correa himself, who is facing 30 different charges. And I mentioned that his party was not even allowed to use his image or his voice. His vice president being in prison under terribly suspicious or specious charges. And we got a chance to talk to his lawyer, who told us how unfair the entire process has been, and how many of the Correa people have been in pre-trial detention, and that even during this time of COVID, they have been stuck in prison, and their lawyers have had to go and try to defend them in the courts, even when, as in the case of Correa's lawyer, he himself had COVID, and the judge refused to postpone the court appearance. There are so many people within the Correa administration who have had to first take refuge in the Mexican embassy and then been given asylum in Mexico. And so the former Correístas are really scattered around. The ones who remain in the country are harassed on a constant basis. In fact, we had a taste of it when we had a meeting with one of the members of parliament of the Correa movement. And when we came out of his office, there was Correa's lawyer there, and immediately a number of police came up in their motorcycles and surrounded us and started harassing us, asking us for our papers, questioning us what we were doing there. And as we were filming them, the Ecuadorians told us, this is nothing. This is just a little taste of the harassment that we get on a regular basis. So they are worried about what the next years will bring. They also had hoped that if the progressives won, that there would be a way for Rafael Correa to return to Ecuador. But right now, that doesn't look like that will happen under the presidency of Guillermo Lasso.
And it's for all of these reasons that even if everyone was playing fair on election day in Ecuador, it's very difficult to characterize this vote as free and fair just when you look at the way the political opposition or the Correísta movement was treated for the last 4 years. Medea Benjamin, co-founder of CODEPINK, thanks so much for breaking all of that down.
Thank you so much. Good to be on with you.